week 15 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first guy, Matt Prater, of the Arizona Cardinals. So Prater versus his former team, the Detroit Lions, here in week 15. And the Lions give up the most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So the last few weeks here, since Murray and Hopkins got back in the lineup, Prater's been solid. Week 13 at Chicago, 8 fantasy points. And week 14 versus the Rams, a huge fantasy day, 16 fantasy points. So right here, versus the worst defense versus kickers on the season here, I think Prater has another big one, and he'll score anywhere from 10 to 12 fantasy points. And he's a must-start kicker this week. The second guy is Robbie Gould of the San Francisco 49ers. So Robbie Gould, he's been pretty decent this season here. But I like the matchup a lot versus the Atlanta Falcons, which is a defense that really doesn't stop anyone. And this San Francisco 49er offense has been pretty decent this season. So I like a lot of 49ers this week as guys to start for your fantasy lineup. And right here, I think Robbie Gould can have a good fantasy day, anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points in the last few weeks for him. Week 12 versus Minnesota, 10. Week 13 at Seattle, 5. And Week 14 at Cincinnati, 7. So right here in this one versus the Atlanta Falcons, a home game here for San Francisco. Like I mentioned, anywhere from 8 to 10 fantasy points. And he's available, surprisingly, in 75% of fantasy leagues. The next kick is Greg the Leg Zuerlein of the Dallas Cowboys. So Zuerlein, the last few weeks here, he's been getting more opportunities where this Cowboy offense has struggled punching the ball into the end zone. They've been getting in the red zone, but just not scoring touchdowns, and Zuerlein's been taking advantage of it. So the last few weeks here for him, Week 12 versus Vegas, 5 fantasy points. Week 13 in New Orleans, 11. And Week 14 at Washington, 12. So right here in Week 15 at the New York Giants, they're going to have many opportunities, once again, in my opinion, are the Cowboys, where they're going to be in the red zone area. And the Giants, their defense, let's be honest, it hasn't been good at all this season here. And they're vulnerable to giving up points, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. So right here, I think Greg the Leg this week easily could go for 7 to 10 fantasy point range. And he's definitely a kicker I would start this week with the matchup and with the offense he's in. The next kick is Brandon McManus of the Denver Broncos. So Brandon McManus, we know he's got one of the best boots in all of pro football. And we know he's a great kicker when he's at Mile High at home in Denver this season. So McManus, the last few games, Week 12 versus the Chargers, 4. Week 13 at Kansas City, 4. And Week 14 versus Detroit, 10. But right here, Week 15 versus Cincinnati, I know they give up the 17th most fantasy points to kickers on the season. But like I mentioned, McManus is at home. Cincinnati's defense is a bend but don't break type of defense. And I think McManus in this one's going to have a good chance to reach double-digit fantasy points. And he's also a kicker right now, widely available in 58% of fantasy leagues. But he's definitely a kicker I would start this week. And the fifth and final kicker I would start is Matt Gay of the Los Angeles Rams. I know the Rams are banged up with a lot of guys on the COVID list, or banged up in general here. And that might mean more opportunities to kick field goals here for Matt Gay. And over the last few weeks here, he's been the best kicker in the 3-week span. Week 12 at Green Bay, 8. Week 13 versus Jacksonville, 15. And Week 14 at Arizona, 14. So Week 15, a good matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks. Now, let's be honest, they really can't stop anyone this season. The Rams, they're going to go up and down the field versus them like they did early in the season when they beat them 26-17. And Matt Gay's another kicker where you could pencil him in each and every week, anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points as well. But this week here, he's definitely going to have a good game, like I mentioned. And this Ram team is a solid team here, and a team that's always in the red zone area. So I definitely would start Gay this week. So that's a few kickers I would start here for Week 15 of the fantasy football season.